All right, Shabbat Shalom, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another sermon here at Nazarene Way Church. And if you are new here, what we are doing here at Nazarene Way Church is we are restoring the first century Judean sect known as the Nazarenes. And later on, they became known as the Ebionites, which is essentially Hebrew for the poor ones, like blessed are the poor ones, right? That's what Ebionites or Ebionim means. And so we are restoring the original movement of Jesus the Nazarene and his disciples and his heirs and his family members, those that walked with Jesus and knew him and knew the principles and carried out what he actually stood for. And we are restoring the Nazarene way, which pre-exists the term Christianos, and which is Greek for Christianity, which was, I believe, first used in Antioch. And what we intend to do is carry forth all of the so-called radical principles that Jesus the Nazarene stood for, that he essentially fought for, figuratively speaking, in his mission to essentially restore the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, and extract out its true principles. You see, over time, the Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament, was essentially added onto, and there's the whole priestly source scribes adding more and more interpretation, rules, laws, punishments, all of that stuff. And what Jesus did is he took the radical move of restoring the true essence of the beautiful Hebrew Bible, which is actually made up of three parts. The first part is called the Torah. These are the 5 books of Moses. Then there's the prophets, and then there's the writings, writings like Proverbs, things like that, right? And you have to read it with a careful eye, and you have to listen to Jesus's words with the idea in mind that the fact is, when Jesus was alive, when he was walking around and preaching, there was no such thing as the New Testament. That was actually first invented by a man named Marcion, who later was called and declared by the Catholic Church a heretic, and then the Catholic Church invented their own New Testament. And that was in, 400, 500 years after the death of Jesus. So there's no such thing as the New Testament during the time of Jesus. Jesus, the scriptures and words he used and studied are found in this, the Hebrew Bible. So what did the Nazarenes actually use for their text? Did they have a New Testament? The answer is no. The people that walked with Jesus, his disciples that actually knew him. And I'm not talking about the likes of Paul, the self-proclaimed apostle, who never knew Jesus, and thanks to him, he essentially invented like 13 of the 27 books in the New Testament are essentially attributed to Paul. So I'm not talking about Paul. He was never an apostle. Paul essentially invented this own Roman Hellenized religion, called Catholicism and Christianity. What we want to do is we want to peel back the layers and go back in time to asking ourselves, what did Jesus's original followers believe? What did they read? What did they use as scripture? What did Jesus use as scripture? What was Jesus's Bible? And the answer is quite simple. It was this right here, the Hebrew Bible. And in doing this, we can also find, in freeing ourselves from the quote unquote canon and the New Testament, which was just assembled and crafted and curated by a bunch of old white-haired Roman figures in the 4th century. And so if you free yourself from that and start asking yourself, okay, what other texts are there out there that actually encapsulate the true nature of Jesus? You can find texts such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Didache, and unfortunately it's lost in its full form, but we know from the patristics and even the critics of the Nazarenes and the church fathers like Jerome and Eusebius and Epiphanius, we know that the Nazarenes had their own gospel, and it was called the Gospel according to the Hebrews. And what we know about it, it was basically essentially like it was the Gospel of Matthew minus the first 2 chapters. And from that, we can really understand the first 2 chapters of Matthew were actually added on and prepended way after the fact. There's the whole mythological birth narrative, which conflicts with the mythological birth narrative, the virgin birth narrative in Luke, for instance. You don't find any of this stuff in Mark, which is the first written gospel. And that is what we use as well. So if you want to be a Nazarene or an Ebionite, you study the Hebrew Bible, you absolve yourself of a lot of the anti-Semitisms that exist in the Roman pagan cult known as Catholicism and Christianity, and you go back to the Hebraic roots that really underpins the movement that Jesus stood for. Jesus was an anti-orthodox, anti-establishment Hebrew Israelite that essentially fought against a lot of the same things that we see present in the religion that is named after him today, Christianity or even Catholicism, right? And so we look to, in my hands, I have the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. This is the George Howard version. This one has a very, very interesting history. And what you want to do is you want to buy this Hebrew Gospel of Matthew and cut out with a razor blade the first 2 chapters, because we know from the church fathers that the original Gospel of the Hebrews did not have the first 2 chapters. And that's what we use from our canon. So with that out of the way, there's one more thing I want to say to anyone that is new here, is the term Nazarene and Nazarene Way Church. We're starting with the humble beginning of being a house church, and we're going to grow and grow and grow until we become an IRL church and, acquire a building and, just restore the original message of Jesus, not, worship a pagan religion concocted by Paul of Tarsus, right? So that's where we are today. That's where you see me basically in this, humble abode, just like, the earliest church, the Jerusalem church, after the death of Jesus, which was led by Jesus's brother, James the Just, who was led and held in, these synagogues or these quote unquote assemblies. They were held in homes, right? And so that's where this is held. Of course, you, the viewer, you can tune in from your home or wherever you are at into my home. And one more thing is that there's this popular church called, I believe it's like the Church of the Nazarene or something. And what that church is, they have essentially hijacked the term Nazarene, and we are on a mission. There's a group of us. I'm not the only Nazarene and Ebionite here to restore it. I mean, I have a cat right here. He's one of them. That's Brodus Maximus. But there's a bunch of us. We are seeking to restore the term Nazarene. And the Church of the Nazarene is actually invented or founded in the 18th or 19th century. And it comes from the Wesleyan tradition, I believe. It's a Baptist church, and we have no association or nothing to do with the Church of the Nazarene. Even though they, seem to have hijacked the term, the problem is you can't trademark a term Nazarene because guess what? It's 2,000 years old, right? It's even present in Acts when the Romans, because the only guy that they know about is Paul, because Paul is preaching to the Romans, so they mistake Paul as the ringleader of the Nazarenes. Wherein then we find in Galatians and even in Acts that Paul goes and answers to James the Just. And James's right-hand man, Simon, Cephas, which is Peter, right? Who the church is, basically proclaim as the first pope, right? And then his left-hand man, James the Just's left-hand man, was John the Apostle, right? So with that out of the way, what we're going to focus on today is a key line in one of Jesus's teachings, the Sermon on the Mount. And it comes from Matthew 5, verse 9. And it is this: "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Let's just hone in on this verse. Let's go deep on this verse. Because this is one of those things, if you're reading the Bible either in the morning or at night, and you're reading Matthew, you just gloss over it and you're on to the next verse before you know it. So let's zero in and focus on Matthew 5:9 and the entire sermon just on this one verse. I'll read it again. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Again, this is in Matthew 5, chapter 5, verse 9. So let's talk about where this took place. Jesus is on a hillside. It's during the Sermon on the Mount. And you have to imagine at the time, the individuals that were held in the highest regard were the Sadducees, the people that ran the temple. They were, unapproachable, right? Impeachable, impeccable. And then there were the Pharisees, who were obsessed with majoring in the minor. They were obsessed with inventing rules, interpreting rules. And, the Pharisees essentially got a rebranding in the Middle Ages, and they became known as Orthodox Judaism, right? And, these are the individuals who, Moses gave us, 10 commandments. Well, fast forward a few hundred years, and the Pharisees got their hands on it, and other scribes and the priestly sources. And if you actually look it up, the Orthodox Judaism, they believe that there's actually 613 commandments that they have to follow. So you can see what happens when mankind or a man gets his hand on some doctrine or religion. He starts inventing all of these rules, right? And usually there's a hidden incentive behind all of those rules, right? Oh, you need to do a flesh sacrifice because flesh sacrifices are popular, around that time, and it requires money, and you need to, first exchange your money in order to actually have a flesh sacrifice, which all the money goes back into the coffers and the pockets of the Sadducees, right? Oh, and why do you have to do this? Oh, well, because it says so right here in Deuteronomy or Leviticus or, some area. And that's, that becomes law number 11, and then 12 and 13, so there's just all of these essentially misguided incentives that results in a pure religion exploding into 613 ridiculous laws. And Jesus fought against that. The Pharisees, many of them, and they were well-intentioned people, but many of them didn't know what to believe. They were told and indoctrinated in a belief, just like many of us are told and indoctrinated from before we can even talk or speak, that, hey, we need to be baptized. We need to go, and be indoctrinated into this religion before we can even think. And before our freaking, puberty hits, you have to go, take a bunch of confirmation classes and get confirmed, right? Before you can actually question and think for yourself. That is the type of environment that the Pharisees, were essentially indoctrinated into. Jesus came to question that, came to read scripture and understand what is the actual bigger idea. Let's not major in the minor. So Jesus was on the hillside. And instead of preaching to those who actually had funds to make some tithes, Jesus was preaching to ordinary people, to the poor ones, to the Ebionites, not rulers, not priests, not a, quote unquote, good, profitable audience, right? And one line shines above all others, and that is, blessed are the peacemakers. He is telling the poor ones, those that are, essentially struggling, those who are suppressed, the ordinary people, to go and make peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. And what this means, let's zoom in on this. What does this actually mean? It means not passive avoidance. It means active repairing and healing. A peacemaker doesn't mean that you just passively step away and avoid the situation altogether. What it means is you diffuse yourself from being involved in this pendulum of love and hate, or they did this to me, I'm going to do this back to them. It revolves around removing yourself from it and not hiding, but offering a reply to this pendulum. Essentially, if someone does something horrible to you, the natural tendency is for you to want to do something horrible back. But Jesus did the exact opposite, right? There were many failed messiahs, which we'll talk about in a moment, and all of the failed messiahs all took action to fight fire with fire. When the Romans, came to conquer Jerusalem, the militant messiahs came to fight back with force. Jesus did the exact opposite. He took the Romans' essentially equipment, wore it, and walked the extra mile than was allowed by the law. He reset the pendulum of someone does something bad to you, you do something bad in retaliation. No, a peacemaker does not do that. Right? And this idea is rooted in the Torah. It's rooted in, if you especially read the Torah and read different prophets with a critical eye to parse out some of the, majoring in the minor, some of the later additions. It revolved around justice, mercy, simplicity. And the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, they lived this out in their own community. There is no accident. It is not an accident that John the Baptist and James the Just and many of the Nazarenes and Ebionites, they were an ascetic community that lived as a community. John the Baptist, we find, in the very beginning of Mark, he's an individual that came from the wilderness, from a community, from separating himself from the absolute chaos and money-chasing Roman society that many people found themselves in at that time. And it is no accident that this is essentially the environment that the Jesus movement took place in and essentially erupted in, because they were able to pry themselves back by being an ascetic society, living in the wilderness, living in communities, such that when they visited Jerusalem, right, and they saw the pendulum swings of tit for tat, someone did this to you, you did this to them, they were able to essentially unplug, kind of like us unplugging from digital devices in this digital age of chaos and, AI nut job society that we kind of find ourselves in today, and fast moving, and someone does something bad to you, you do something bad to them to get them back, right? They lived, and John the Baptist lived outside of that system, and it primed John the Baptist and then Jesus, to see what happens when you actually, instead of retaliating, to answer when someone wrongs you, not with anger, not with spite, not with getting them back, but with love, with being a peacemaker. And this matters because the world honors conquerors and warriors, and it does so even today. Fight with strength, right? Fight back. Hamas even. Hamas does something horrible to, Israel, and Israel strikes back, with 10 times the amount of force, right? And, poses as the Israel defense, forces, right? Like they're defending themselves. Well, guess what? This whole instance in like Hamas and essentially retaliating with force is not new. It existed for 10, 12, 20,000 plus years, especially in the near Middle East. And what we find is that even around the time of Jesus is, essentially his siblings and his family, they were named after a failed Messiah. There was a man, Judas the Galilean, and he essentially existed before Jesus' time. And Judas the Galilean was a failed Messiah. His sons was Simon and his relatives. And, Jesus had a brother named Judas, but because the Roman pagan cult of Catholicism didn't want to, essentially confuse Judas with Judas Iscariot, they renamed Judas Jude. And you can find Jude, hidden in the back of the New Testament. Fantastic, fantastic work. And, Eusebius, we have many accounts. And you can look up Jude. They, of course, call him Saint Jude now. And what's even more hilarious is that even Catholics think that Jude is a woman and a great saint, a woman, because of, the Beatles song, Hey Jude. They, for some reason, think that Jude is a woman. And so I know several people, actually, and I've, that I've told my mom this. My mom has a friend, and the friend named like their daughter, or maybe the middle name, or maybe Jude, the daughter, because they think Jude is a woman. Jude was Jesus's brother, one of Jesus's brother. It was Jesus first, then James, then Jude, then I believe Joseph, and then Simon or Simeon, who many confuse to be the cousin of Jesus. And then Jesus also had two sisters. You can find this, it's hidden in plain sight in Mark or even John. They list the roster of Jesus' siblings. And of course, you find a lot of Catholics trying to do a bunch of hand waving to distract from this fact, because then that would completely invalidate their crazy theory that, Mother Mary was a virgin and a perpetual virgin, where her hymen was intact even after giving birth to Jesus, which actually comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is an apocryphal, non-canonical gospel or text, which is completely, purely ironic if you actually do the research on this. So the bottom line is all of the messiahs, like Judas the Galilean, who was a failed messiah, and even Bar Kokhba, who existed about 100 years after Jesus' death and many thought was the Messiah. All of these messiahs were failed messiahs, but they were completely different than Jesus. They were called militant messiahs. They went to war and tried to fight against Rome. They tried to deny Rome its taxes, and then Rome came with all their soldiers and just essentially wiped them out. And you can find graphic instances of, I think, Judas the Galilean's, one of his sons that took over the movement, was captured and beheaded in a river. And there's just all this crazy stuff if you look into a lot of these other failed messiahs who people thought was the Messiah, here to restore the power and the kingdom of the Hebrews, of the Israelites, right? They were all failed messiahs, and most of the, I would say, 99.99% of the 8 billion people on this planet Earth do not know about these failed messiahs because they didn't do anything extraordinary. They tried to fight fire with fire. They tried to retaliate. They tried to fight force with force. Whereas Jesus is remembered and is the most famous person in history because he did the exact opposite. He was a peacemaker. And even today, again, the world honors conquerors and warriors, but Jesus tells us to flip this concept on its head. The children of God that we find in this quote are those who restore, are those who are the peacemakers, are those who do not destroy, but those who restore and live according to Jesus the Nazarene. And the promise is essentially that we need to remind ourselves when we are tied up into, hey, yeah, but in business, someone did this to me and I have to protect myself for the sake of my family. No, you don't. You need to reduce the importance of whatever thing is happening to you. You need to step outside it. You need to trust in God. You need to let it flow to you, and you need to respond in peace. That does not mean laying down or running away. That means not responding in a way that escalates the situation and responding with anger and with fighting. And the application that we can essentially think of today, or essentially live with today, there's really three things we can instantiate this advice and apply it to our own lives. The first is in your home. So when inside of your home, blessed are your neighbors. Guess who is your most similar and closest neighbor? It's your loved ones. It's your family members. It's those who exist in your home. Whenever there's strife, whenever there's tension, whenever there's tempers, Don't react by snipping at the other person, by trying to retaliate, by trying to defend yourself, by trying to prove that you are right. Forgive them. Be open, curious, and committed to learning. Do not be closed, defensive, and committed to being right. The entire world lives in a state where they are oscillating between those two lines. And most of the world, for most of the time, they live in a state where they are closed-minded, defensive, and they are committed to being right. Instead, be open-minded, be curious, and be committed to learning. Be a peacemaker. Forgive. Forgive inside your own home. In your community, care for the poor. Don't walk over the homeless. Care for those who are overlooked. If a homeless person asks for money, or even go on missions and give homeless people clothing, extra clothing, go through your own closet. Have extra clothing in your car so that the next time you see a homeless person begging, you don't give them money or cash. You give them what they really need. Attention, love, by saying, hey, I picked these out of my closet. I picked these clothes, especially if it gets cold. It even gets cold in Southern California. I used to go out when I was living in San Diego and give people, I bought a tent at one point, a really, really nice tent from REI, and a beautiful, nice sleeping bag that I only used like once in 3 years, on an off-roading trip, right? So I took that and I went around and on a cold night, I found, a homeless man that was sleeping, right, in a, basically like just on the sidewalk, freezing. And I gave him that sleeping bag. Doing those types of tasks is what Jesus actually did. That's why 8 billion people know him. That's why 8 billion people still talk about him to this day, 2,000 years after his death. It is not because he attended Mass every Sunday and stood up and sat down 15 different times and listened to some old guy fart away in some dumb sermon. It's because he was a radical giver and peacemaker. That is why we know him, and that is why you should strive to be like him. The second or third thing, so we've got here's how you should act like Jesus in your home, in your community. The third thing is how you should act like Jesus in your heart. Cast off envy, cast off wrath, cast off resentment. Whenever someone wrongs you, step outside of it. Reduce the importance. Do not retaliate with anger. Take a day. Follow maybe the 24-hour rule. Before you retaliate or do something, sleep on it. Act 24 hours after the fact. And do not respond with anger, resentment. So the closing thought is this. The way, capitalized way, the way that Jesus followed is not waiting on Rome, on priests, on power, or looking up to them, or looking to Rome, or the Roman Catholic Church, or the priest, or the pastor for guidance and for power. It is through looking into the scripture, reading the Hebrew Bible just as Jesus read it, and acting and living in the beautiful example that Jesus set for us all. It revolves around praying to God, taking God seriously, the one God. Jesus was not God, even though we've created this whole mythological idea that he was. The whole Trinitas was invented by a man named Tertullian in the 2nd century. Jesus never talked about that. He never once said that there is a Trinity. None of his disciples did, right? Jesus knew, and he followed the first commandment there is. There is one God. Take it seriously. Pray to God. Don't pray to idols. Next is this, is the way equals us making peace daily by action. Action matters more than faith. Paul of Tarsus perpetuated the most ridiculous doctrine ever that falls and flies in the face of everything Jesus stood for. Jesus stood for taking action, peaceful action, becoming a peacemaker. Whereas Paul said you don't have to take that action at all. If you want to be redeemed, if you want to gain salvation, if you want to see your loved ones in heaven, all you have to do is profess that I believe in Jesus and I believe he resurrected from the dead. That's what you are brainwashed into believing. But guess who never said that once? Yeshua the Nazarene, otherwise known as Jesus. Yeshua was his actual Aramaic name. Jesus came from Luceos, something like that. I'm butchering the pronunciation, but essentially Luceos, which in Greek, and then we transliterated it into English into being Jesus, right? So Yeshua stood for the exact opposite of that. Same with his brother James the Just, and you can find this in the book of James, hidden in the back of the New Testament. James says, faith alone isn't what gains salvation. Action matters over faith. And that is what I want to call you to do. I want to call you to act by walking in the way that Jesus walked. Become a peacemaker. Become a child of God. Step outside the crazy pendulum that life revolves around. Each person is a pendulum. Each society is a pendulum. Anything involving a movement is a pendulum of forces going back and forth. And the key that you need to embrace is you need to step outside that pendulum and don't be the other ball that swings back. You need to respond, just as Jesus responded, with peace, doing the unexpected, and ridding yourself of resentment and anger in your life. I hope you enjoyed this sermon. Shabbat Shalom. I will see you next week, and enjoy the Hebrew Bible and reading and parsing the same exact scripture that Jesus himself read. Peace and love, and I'll see you next week.